Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where we talk about the upcoming election and answer your questions. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge, Michigan. We're going to be moderating today's discussion. We have a different group of folks with us today. We have Jordyn Hermani, Mike Wilkinson, and Malachi Barrett. We're looking forwards and backwards from the primary to general election. We've got Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as they're building momentum. But November 5th is still about 3 months away, and a lot can change in that time. So we're going to be talking about warnings for both the Democrats and the Republicans, whether to believe the polls, what voter interest looks like, and what's up with U.S. Rep. Shri Thanedar. If you have questions for our reporters, you can drop it in the chat and we will get to those. As you probably know, we're also recording this event and you'll be able to see a full recap at our website, bridgemi.com. Jordyn, you were at the Kamala Harris rally last week. Over the weekend, Donald Trump made some news talking about that rally. What's going on there?
So Trump on Sunday on his own social media website, Truth Social, falsely claimed that nobody attended the Harris campaign rally at a Metro Detroit airport hangar. That was in Romulus, and I and my colleague Malachi Barrett can firmly attest that there were people there. He's claiming that the Harris campaign is showing an AI generated, so fake photo to boost their crowd size. That is not the case. I know that the Harris campaign was quoted as saying there were about 15,000 people who attended. I know that we weren't able to verify that specific number, but there were definitely people there. The argument that this was an AI generated image doesn't hold much water. Individuals are pointing to the fact that people's hands are in weird positions or their faces look weird. Unfortunately, that's just sometimes what you get when you're shooting with either specific lenses or an iPhone photo. Not certain, some of the images that are being shared of the crowd are being shared by people who were at the rally themselves. I personally was able to post a video showing the number of people who were at the rally. It's quite large. So yeah, he's iterating this completely false claim that there was nobody at the Harris rally on Wednesday of last week, when that's just simply not true.
It's kind of interesting. There was the big kind of evidence in this is people have been drawing like a red circle. You'll probably see if you've seen any of the discussion about this online around the reflection of Air Force Two that apparently doesn't reflect people in it, which is just very strange to me because it just kind of shows that for people that were not present at this rally, you don't really understand like the logistics of the location of people. I mean, when the vice president comes off Air Force Two, there's quite a bit of separation between the stair that she comes down and the public. They don't want people right up close on the plane. There's an entire staff of crew that comes off. There's a pool reporters that come off that need to get in vehicles that move around. So the fact that they weren't like immediately up to the plane and may not be visible in that reflection is not really like the gotcha that people seem to be basing this entire claim on. I also want to point out there's a lot of like social media chatter around this. I saw a ton of videos on TikTok last night and this morning, and in a really misleading way, there would be kind of like photo collages of the claim that the former president was making, and then a photo from like the AP or one of the many reporters that were there documenting this event, and then an AI manipulated photo. And that AI manipulated photo did not come from the Kamala Harris campaign, didn't come from a reporter, it was just an AI generated image. But there are people online that were claiming that image is connected to the event. So there's an entire kind of like layer now of like misinformation online that is starting to kind of bend around this. And I would just, caution people about where they are. There's so many photos of this event. Jordyn took photos, I took photos. We had staff photographers that were there. I mean, it's interesting, this debate over rally sizes. We can maybe talk about that, but it looked like a lot like the Trump rallies that were held in 2020 at airport hangars. COVID kind of shut down a lot of typical campaign activities, and Trump was holding large gatherings in these aircraft hangars. It looked a lot like that. I mean, obviously the tone was very different, the substance of the event was different, but it wasn't like a remarkably different crowd from what we've seen in Michigan presidential campaigns in the past.
That's a good point, Malachi. Can either you or Jordyn speak to how does that compare to what we're seeing now on the Trump campaign? Are the size of rallies at Trump rallies different now than they were in 2020, and are they different than the Harris rallies?
I mean, I guess I can speak to that. For what it's worth, this discussion of crowd size, I do just want to emphasize ahead of talking about it. Crowd size means effectively nothing in the long scheme of things. How many people you draw to a rally does not mean anything. How many yard signs you see out and about does not mean anything. We saw that in 2020 when Biden won Michigan, and the argument was, well, no one showed up to his rallies. I never saw a yard sign. So this whole argument, this whole conversation about, well, who drew a bigger crowd? It's irrelevant, frankly. That being said, there was a sense of excitement among voters who were at this Kamala Harris rally last week. There was a sense of, and it broke out as a chant a couple times, "We're not going back," alluding to the Trump presidency. There was just a ton of people who were finally excited to be able to vote for somebody who they saw a little bit more of themselves in. Obviously, Harris is a much younger candidate than Biden is. Her running mate, Tim Walz, only has a year difference in age than her. So we're running two much younger candidates. They're able to speak to voters and articulate in very coherent ways what their issues are, what kind of substance that they're hoping to bring if elected to the White House. And yeah, I mean, people were just really excited to be there.
Democrats didn't get to do this in 2020. I mean, they effectively shut down any kind of large rallies that are typical of a presidential campaign because of the pandemic, obviously. And Jordyn's right. I mean, people had claimed that Biden couldn't have won Michigan because he had nobody at his rallies in 2020. He didn't really hold rallies. They were all, smaller events that were mostly invite only because of the pandemic. He went on to win the state anyway. Rally size as a measure of enthusiasm is also interesting to me because the people that are at the rally are tend to be kind of your diehard supporters. They tend to be people who are, involved in the political machine already. Rallies are kind of a function of getting them energized and ready to volunteer and work for the campaign. I mean, there are some, normal, typical people there, but they are already kind of leaning to one side. So are you winning new voters? Are you, is that a show of like how strong your coalition is in Michigan? I don't know. I think some of that is kind of debatable. But I think it's really, the enthusiasm around this is really because even in 2022, we were kind of in the shadow of the pandemic and Governor Whitmer was able to hold some events. But this is really the first time in quite a while that Democrats have been able to kind of come together like this. And yeah, we're a battleground state, man. I mean, people are excited to go to these rallies.
And Detroit's a Democratic stronghold. Malachi, what are you seeing on the ground there? We've seen concerns about turnout. Is that panning out?
Yeah, well, we have yet to really see what impact Kamala Harris ascending to the top of the ticket does on voter participation. Anecdotally, I did talk with a handful of Detroiters at the polls last week who said that they actually decided to vote in the primary because she was at the top of the ticket. And there's one woman in particular who was just kind of like fed up with politics this year. She wasn't going to vote in August. She wasn't going to vote in November. She was Democratic leaning, but she was very frustrated with the party going with Biden again. And Harris replacing him caused her to, reevaluate that decision and go out and vote in the primary. We've seen a lot how it's resurged interest in some of the down ballot races. It's resurged some interest among younger voters, although we can talk a little bit more about that. It's certainly, I've talked to a lot of Black women in Detroit who are more excited now to vote for Kamala Harris. They were, certainly fans of Biden, but they connect better to the vice president. She's a Kappa sister. There's a lot of people in Detroit who's got the Kappa bumper stickers or license plates. The turnout numbers themselves, it's kind of hard to draw conclusions from. Turnout was under 16% last week. Wayne County, it was around 19%. That's kind of typical for primary races. Obviously, Harris wasn't on the ballot. She and Biden were on the ballot in the February presidential primary where turnout was around 12%. There's a lot of probably factors around that. Is it lack of enthusiasm for Biden? Is it that there really wasn't any choice to be made in that primary? Is it the uncommitted vote having an impact? Which, there were around 5,000 Detroit voters who voted uncommitted in that primary. Turnout in 2020 was 51%, which sounds pretty good. It's certainly higher than 2016. And this is kind of the fundamental challenge for Michigan Democrats. I mean, it's really hard for Republicans to win the state when turnout in Detroit and Wayne County is high. And there were concerns from Detroit Democrats that the Biden campaign just wasn't really getting a convincing message across to voters here. and there were a lot of concerns from voters about his age and, you know, litany of other things that caused him to drop out of the race. And that does seem to have changed with Harris. Again, it's all kind of anecdotal right now, but I am hearing for younger voters who are maybe sitting on the fence, for women, and you know, it's gotten people more engaged. There was one woman, I'll just leave us with this. She and her 93-year-old mother were going to start phone banking for Kamala Harris, and they hadn't done that since Obama. And there's a lot of people that are making Obama comparisons in terms of like the enthusiasm and the energy. And I think that, you know, is something really to watch. You know, also she's going to have to navigate the concerns of Arab American and Muslim voters and younger voters who are upset about, you know, furious really about the administration's handling of Gaza. So that is an impact in Detroit and Wayne County as well. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I think, turned around the situation where people were feeling kind of dire and not very optimistic. People are pretty optimistic now.
Yeah, and so not only with Biden dropping out, but of course there was the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump just a few weeks ago. There's been a lot of historical events. Can polls accurately predict who will win? And Mike, can you talk a little bit about whether polls have improved over the last few years?
The quality of the polls. I mean, one thing that was really confounded pollsters, and you know, the quality that kind of made them underrepresent Trump in 2016. I mean, you know, at the end, just before he won Michigan, Hillary Clinton was leading in the polls, and she had a substantial gap the whole time. The problem that they found was that they didn't predict who was actually going to be in the electorate, who was actually going to show up on election day. And a lot of people that Trump brought out had not been traditional voters, so that became a problem for pollsters to kind of predict. I mean, the people who answered their questions didn't necessarily lie, but two things happened. A lot of Republicans were unwilling to say they were voting for Trump. And two, you couldn't predict who was going to be in the electorate. Well, that got a little better in 22. And this year, you would presume, you would hope that they've learned their lesson, because so many pollsters got it wrong in the first couple of years of the Trump phenomenon. But what we have seen since Joe Biden announced that he was not going to seek re-election was that his numbers, which were doing, he was very underwater in Michigan to Trump and in many other battleground states, that gap has gone away. That Trump, I mean, that Harris right now, it's almost as if we've had a convention and you get a convention bump. She seems to have gotten, and I'm actually the candidate bump. And she now in Michigan, and there's a poll over the weekend from the New York Times, a high quality poll where she gets 50% of the votes of likely voters. Trump gets 46. Caveat here is that's if they're just the two people on the ballot and won't vote or refuse to answer is the other choice. If RFK Jr. is in the race, Trump does better. So it does now appear to look like that RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the late senator and the nephew of the late president, could play spoiler in Michigan if he remains on the ballot, at least a spoiler in terms of Trump. But the polls, they are showing that the race is moving in a direction that favors Democrats right now, but it's still mid-August. Well, it's not even mid-August. We've got a long way to go. We've got a convention to go. We've got revelations to go. We've got a lot of rallies to go. So I think right now the poll will only tell us what kind of general mood and direction is going, but it doesn't tell us the final answer.
That's good to know. And it's a good word of warning for us as we're 3 months out. We also have turnout data from last week's primary. Turnout was down, more Democrats than Republicans voted. What, if anything, can we conclude from that?
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting. I mean, one, I would say nothing, because, you know, give one example in 2014, then the U.S. House Representative Gary Peters was running in an uncontested primary for the U.S. Senate, and he got 500,000 votes. Terry Lynn Land, the former Secretary of State, Republican, ran in another uncontested primary, and she got 80,000 more votes. She got 584,000 votes. So she wins, right? No, he crushes her 1.7 million to 1.3 million. So you never know who's showing up in a primary. You don't know if the local school board race is a big one. You don't know if the local county commission race is a big one. There are other things on the ballot. So I don't think it's necessarily an indication. In Detroit, we saw 15.3% of the population show up. That's a really low number. Well, that's the same number that showed up in 2020 or 2022. But what happened? What really matters is what happens in November. Can a Harris Walz ticket roll up a 250,000 vote margin like Biden did, and then sustain what will be the overall Trump victory in the other counties. So I don't think turnout is as indicative of what's going to happen. I mean, think about what's happened in the last couple of elections. We've had marijuana on the budget, we've had abortion on the budget, but on the ballot, and those things goose turn out as well. We don't have one of those this time, so it's going to be pretty much just the candidates. But what happened in the primary, I don't think is going to be predictive of turnout in the general.
Well, and not to mention, I know Tuesday feels like forever ago, especially in terms of politics, but Tuesday's weather was really crummy. It rained. A big portion of the state, if I'm remembering correctly, was like mildly under tornado watch. That absolutely can affect turnout, not to mention, obviously, as Mike mentioned, the number of local issues that could bring a person out, even if they weren't intending to vote in any other kind of race.
And one thing, I mean, glad Jordyn mentioned that. One of the things that Republicans had always relied upon being better at was they had senior citizens would vote absentee and kind of get away from the weather, right? You're sitting in your home, writing and putting in the envelope. Well, now that we have no what's the word?
No reason absentee.
No reason absentee. Democrats took a big lead, and then you had at the same time you had the Trump administration and Trump himself say he didn't trust it. Well, they seem to have changed their tune, and this most recent election did show that Republicans became more comfortable either voting early. They actually more people voted early Republican than voted early Democrat, and they did somewhat embrace mail-in absentee ballots. So that will somewhat take weather out of the equation. It'll never be like 2020 when everyone got sent an application, but we are seeing that the difference between the two parties in terms of early voting, early being that absentee or in person, is leveled a little bit.
For sure. And speaking of Trump, his running mate JD Vance was in Michigan last week. He took questions from reporters. Trump held his own press conference in Florida. Both of them are making a big deal and saying that Democrats, particularly Harris, hasn't been accessible to the press or have been taking questions. How big of a deal is this to the media and to voters?
So I think that that's a two-part question. Obviously, as someone who works in the media, we obviously have something to gain by her answering questions here. Does the average person, does the average voter care whether or not we have press access? I'd argue no. I mean, obviously, we stand in as proxies for voters, especially in a swing state like Michigan. If we can get Harris, if we can get Walz, if we could get Vance, Trump, whomever, to answer a question about Michigan's specific policies that they could be implementing if elected, obviously that serves our voters personally. But outside of that, I mean, Harris has spoken with national press. There's videos of her approaching national press to talk with them. So I imagine, especially considering that the Harris-Walz ticket was only cemented as of last week, Tuesday, I believe, not Monday. Again, it's been a long time, but her campaign was only cemented last week. If you think about the fact that Trump and Vance have had some time to get out, get their ducks in a row, be able to get their talking points to speak with media individuals, you know, it's more than likely coming. But does the average voter care about it? I don't really know, frankly.
I mean, the Republicans also had their convention already and therefore should have a policy platform to speak more in detail about. The DNC hasn't happened yet. And I wonder if that, you know, if we'll have more meat on the bone, so to speak, to talk about after that. Is usually when the party rolls out its platform. You know, because the events in Michigan last week from the Harris-Walz campaign were more light on like specific policy proposals and specific things that they would do for Michigan, certainly. And more kind of about unifying and kind of coalescing Democrats around this new ticket. I will say at the Harris and Walz came to a UAW hall in Wayne the day after their large airport rally. And, you know, there was some time where she was meeting with people who were kind of gathered along the outside of the stage that they had built and, you know, taking selfies and, you know, talking to voters, you know, kind of one-on-one. And reporters were kept back from that. Otherwise, I'm sure we would have been yelling questions to the vice president in hopes that maybe she would respond. She actually did respond to a question from one national reporter about the debates coming in September. But, you know, those are opportunities where potentially local reporters from the state who have a better sense of what maybe voters want to know about or things that are kind of burning questions in their mind we would be able to ask. And so far, we haven't had that opportunity. And, we really didn't get that opportunity in 2020 either. I'm really hoping that changes, because I do think there is value in the candidates sitting down with reporters from the state that they're trying to curry favor in. But we'll see. I mean, they're going to be back a lot, so we could see more opportunities.
Right. JD Vance is coming to West Michigan later this week. We had a reader question who asked about Vance's effectiveness. Can anyone speak to how effective Vance has been?
In terms, I guess, of a senator, or in terms of a running mate to Trump? Because I will admit, as a senator, I have very little knowledge of JD Vance's Senate sort of list of accomplishments. Historically, though, who's on the vice presidential campaign, the best person is a person who does not create any waves effectively. I mean, I think we can remember the Sarah Palin, John McCain ticket, and how Palin did somewhat end up becoming something of a public person of ridicule because of the way that she spoke and because of the way that she interacted with voters. Vance, so far as a vice presidential candidate, I mean, he's been speaking, obviously, we just talked about with reporters in Michigan. He is continuing to push the Trump administration, or the sort of campaign talking point about mass deportations, and continuing to speak of high levels of crime. That seems to be the bread and butter where he's at right now. And so far as his effectiveness, not quite sure, frankly. I mean, he is going to be somebody that's going to stay with the campaign. Whether or not the Trump campaign finds him effective, I guess I don't personally know.
Do you think voters care, though? I mean, this is a tight race. We know who Trump is, we know who Harris is. But Walz and Vance are new people on the block for the general voter. So does it matter how effective Vance is as a running mate to whether someone votes for Trump or Harris?
Well, I want to jump in here because I mean, I actually live in Toledo, Ohio, so I saw Vance in the Senate race here, and when he was on the debate stage with a really good Democrat, in terms of someone who had statewide name recognition and was a high quality candidate, he cleaned his clock at times in the debate. So I think some of these missteps, the childless cat ladies and his pro-natalist stuff is clearly hurting him right now. He's getting a lot of headlines. I think his value to the party will be seen as we go farther, because he's a little bit more articulate of what he wants to do, which might scare some people, might scare a lot of people, than Mike Pence was. So I think his impact will be in the future, although he's getting them all the wrong headlines they never asked for right now.
For sure. Pivoting for a second, Malachi, you cover U.S. Rep. Shri Thanedar. He seems almost certain to win a second term. He just won his primary last week, but there seems to be some discontent between him and from the political class. What are constituents saying, and why does he keep winning?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really kind of interesting situation, because he has won a majority of votes in the city of Detroit in every election that he has participated in, as he's quick to tell folks, going back to when he ran for governor in 2018, in that primary, to when he ran for the state legislature, to when he won his first term last year by emerging from a crowded ticket of 9 Democrats who were running that primary. And then again on Tuesday, when he defeated a city council member of Detroit and a former attorney for the city of Detroit, he actually got a majority of votes in the city. So what he will say is that, people, voters, constituents are happy with his performance and are happy to reelect him for a second term. He has made quite an effort to be present in the district, be it through mailers that show up at your house 3 times a week in the lead up to election day, billboards, digital ads, as well as showing up to community events and any number of different events around town. He's kind of known for being a man about the district, and you can kind of run into him places. While at the same time, there is quite a big rift, I would say, with the establishment Democratic leadership in Detroit, in Wayne County, particularly the Black leadership, that is, still really appalled at losing Black representation in Congress when the district was redrawn and Thanedar won in 2020, or 2022, sorry. He was the first person to break that streak of Black representation in Congress, and that's really important for voters that I talk to, as well as Warren County Executive Warren Evans, Wayne County Executive, sorry, and other members of the legislature. There was quite a big effort to unite around Mary Waters. The mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan, endorsed her. He didn't necessarily get out and campaign much on her behalf, but put his kind of name behind her. And ultimately, it didn't manage to stop Representative Thanedar from winning again. So he said on election night that if he won re-election, it would be because he has served his constituents well and plans to continue to do that. But I think there's still a lot of questions around his political ambitions, the amount of money he was able to put into the race. Did he buy this seat? Is there more to be said about the organizing power of Black Democrats in Detroit and in Wayne County? It kind of really depends on who you run into on Shri Thanedar. I think a lot of people kind of roll their eyes and they're like, oh, Shri, what has he actually done? But voters are, content to send him back to Washington again. So,
yeah. It's one thing on the billboard, it's another thing to see what you see on the ground, which is why it's so important to have you here. So we want to get to some reader questions. We also want to be respectful of your time. So we're going to try to keep these relatively brief. We had a question about if third-party candidates are going to affect the Michigan election at all. I know briefly we talked about RFK. There's also Jill Stein. Mike, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, it absolutely affected it in 2016 when third-party candidates got nearly 200,000 votes in Michigan, and both Trump and Hillary Clinton got 47%. Trump got 47.3. He got about 10,000 votes more. But there's a lot of criticism that some of the people who were running as third-party candidates stole the election from Hillary or affected her. Happened, John Anderson did it in 1980, if my memory recollects. Ralph Nader in 2000. So it's not an unknown phenomenon. But right now, RFK Jr. is the big player here. There was the presumption that he was taking from both Trump and from Biden when Biden was in the race. That appears to have changed. So there's been a lot of footsie back and forth between the Trump campaign and RFK about maybe getting him out of the race, and who knows if that happens, and then it's just a two-person, or there are other people on the candidate, two-person race. It could change dramatically.
Thanks for that. We also had a question about term limits. They wanted to know if Mike Rogers, who's a Republican candidate for Senate, if he's going to face any sort of term limits in Congress. Ooh, Jordyn, I think you're
So short answer, will Mike Rogers be affected at all by term limits? No, not at all. Term limits only exist for representatives and senators at the state level in Michigan, which actually just recently changed. You can serve 12 overall years in the legislature. Senate terms are 4 years, House terms are 2 years. So however you want to slice and dice that, you could both serve in the House and the Senate. For the U.S. Senate, there are no term limits. There are no term limits for the U.S. House of Representatives either. The only person at the federal level who does have term limits is the president. So that's a non-issue for Mike Rogers in this race.
Gotcha. And then let's end on fundraising. We have a lot of questions about voting and about how much money is being poured into these races. I've got two questions for you. The first one, Jordyn, there's been a well-documented rift in the Michigan GOP party. I'm wondering at this point, has that led to concerns about how much money is being fundraised?
So here's the thing, especially with statewide races, there was never an issue of was there going to be some level of fundraising in that. Now, fundraising for the Michigan Republican Party has rebounded some, but like I said, this is just causing people, or prior to, it's not like people were going to stop donating to Republican causes. They would just donate straight to the candidate rather than go through the state party apparatus. So, for instance, Mike Rogers for Senate, that's always going to draw huge dollars, especially from out-of-state donors. Big historical GOP donors are very likely to support his campaign directly if they felt like there was any risk from the state party that money wouldn't go to him. Same thing with Slotkin. Right now, she's actually on track to outspend Rogers by a significant amount of money. As of last Wednesday, there had already been nearly $36 million in general election ad reservations for the Democratic candidate, so Slotkin, as compared to the just under $19 million that Rogers' campaign has noted. So we're already seeing those dollars go where they need to. And whether or not the state party is going to bounce back from that fundraising issues they had under the Karamo administration, you know, it's likely to happen.
And then a follow-up question to that is, like, I watch a lot of YouTube. I see a lot of YouTube ads at the start of my videos, whether it's an ad for President Trump or an ad for Kamala Harris. Is either party at this point worried about running out of money?
Running out of money is not something that I have heard enter the conversation at all. You know, as we just mentioned, there's already millions in spending in Michigan's open Senate seat. There's going to be millions and millions of spending on behalf of the Trump campaign for promoting Trump or going against Vice President Kamala Harris, vice versa for the Harris campaign. So yeah, just expect to see those ads ramp up the closer and closer we get to election day, because as far as I'm aware, money is not an issue right now.
Okay, awesome. Well, Jordyn, Mike, and Malachi, thank you so much for being here and answering reader questions. If you all have more questions for our team, you can go to our website at bridgemi.com. There we have an elections tracker, we have a nonpartisan voter guide, and every single day we have new election stories. Our website will also later today have a full recording of today's event. And if you want even more political news, you can sign up for our free Politics Watch newsletter at bridgemi.com/signup. Thank you again for being here, and we'll see you next week.